Thank you for joining us today. I promise you this is going to be a transformative webinar. My name is Amelia Larson, and I serve as the Executive Vice President of Innovations and Academic Partnerships at American Reading Company. We will be recording today's session, and you will be receiving an email with additional information regarding our upcoming webinars. Please feel free to submit your comments and questions in the chat box. Wendy will be monitoring the conversation and will elevate your questions. Now, if you are on social media, remember to use the hashtag ArcLearns as you share your learning with others. Today's a special day. Vital questions about how to ensure all school-age children learn to read and write well and with confidence have gained even greater urgency in the past couple of years. Today, our conversation is designed to help us think about moving elementary students, never too early, to advanced levels of literacy development. I want to especially welcome Dr. Alfred Tatum. He's the Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at Metropolitan State University of Denver. Prior to his move to Colorado, he served as the Dean of the College of Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He's a former middle school teacher and reading specialist. His research and advocacy are aimed at advancing the literacy development of African American boys. He focuses on the roles of texts and instruction to nurture social and scientific consciousness across the disciplines as a path toward intellectual and personal development. We will be referencing his latest book. It is a must-have. Teaching Black Boys in the Elementary Grades, Advanced Disciplinary Reading and Writing to Secure Their Futures. Dr. Tatum also has recently joined American Reading Company's Academic Advisory Board, and we're just thrilled and so proud to be associated with him. Dr. Tatum, welcome.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the introduction. It's always wonderful to be with the American Reading Company, and I appreciate everyone who's joining us today.
So let's get started with this conversation. And this book truly is a book that has transformed me. I have told you this, it really touched my soul, my heart, my mind. And you write about the way research and conceptual papers currently that focus on Black boys may be contributing to the current narrative and how reading and writing can become tools of protection. So can you talk a little bit about this and your reason for writing this book?
Yeah, I'll start here. For many years, we've talked about reading and writing as a pathway to achieve some type of score or school or educational metric. What has become increasingly clear to me is that we are combating Black male erasure. And I mean cultural erasure, but also erasure across the disciplines. And so I have become deeply concerned that there is an absence or low presence of Black males across all of the academic disciplines. And much of that takes roots in the elementary grades. And so while we've been talking about nurturing readers and writers, we've talked about it from a limited space. And I said, what if we change the formula to imagine or create a pathway to have these boys read and write across advanced levels while we're nurturing social and scientific consciousness? And I took the bold move several years ago to say this could happen as early as third grade. And that led to a 2.5-year study where I became a witness to these boys doing extraordinary things, in reading, in writing, but also I could see this intellectual production from 8-year-old boys. And that's not how the nation talks about elementary age children. We don't focus on the life of the mind. We've been focused on reading scores. And I think that has been a gross miscalculation.
In your book, you talk about how the Black intellectual tradition helped you frame the solution. Can you talk a little bit about this and like the pathways that you identify in the book?
Well, there are a couple of things. It's important to know how I conceptualize teaching reading to teaching Black boys in elementary grades. I needed a different type of litmus test for these young boys. And so what I did was begin to read all of the text by intellectuals, men and women. I observed how they write, what they write, the topics they write about, and that became the grounding for the work. And I found several things. Intellectuals write from an interdisciplinary perspective. And so you can see biology, chemistry, physics, law in the same text. But they write across so many different forms, essays, polemics, short stories. They even write equations. We often don't think about Black boys writing equations as a form of writing. They become voracious readers. So that indicated that there's a need to turn up the volume of text among young Black boys. And they use these interpretive and analytical tools. And so I can look at a subject matter in one discipline and have it be informed by other disciplines. And lastly, there was a desire to shape the thinking of others. Now, you don't achieve those things with a strong conceptualization that shapes how we think about instruction, how we think about text, and moreover, how we think about creating an intellectual architecture and a relationship with Black boys in schools so that they restore a sense of confidence as they are marching to a pathway to combat the erasure that they've been experiencing for 400 years. So the intellectual tradition gives a clear litmus test that is a radical departure from how we typically think about elementary school literacy.
And I love how you provided so many examples across the chapters of the book, even like what you read, you share with us. And one of the things that came across to me is, can we do this for kids if we don't experience ourselves? And you modeled how your reading and your type of reading across your curiosity brought so much to this text. But chapter 2, I told you before, the chapter 2 spoke to me in a manner, you always talk about your resolves at the end, and I hope you will do that today, but one of your resolves is not on my watch. In chapter 2, that's what happened to me. It was like, not on my watch. I have to do something about this. But can you talk about how darkness is manifested in literacy practices?
Yeah, so in chapter 2, for those listening, the title of the chapter is The Iconography of Darkness. And somehow Black boys have become symbolized from this point of darkness. At one point, we called Africa the dark continent. And so this is not by accident that this has emerged. And I make the case that there is an urgency to deal with darkness before it takes root. And what I mean by that, some of our boys have this rewarding darkness. And so they excel despite anything that you put in front of them. But there are some kids, particularly if they do not read well and how others react to them, they have this suffocating darkness. And they lose confidence in schooling, they lose confidence in themselves. In many ways, this begins to destroy the psyche. I want to put this in a broader context. When Emmett Till's body was thrown in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River, the bottom of the river is dark. But when I read the court transcripts as part of this record, when they threw his body in the river, they said, we never want him to rise from the bottom. And so darkness can cement you into the lowest hierarchy, into intellectual, economic, political, social, cultural, disciplinary, and that has to be addressed. And so if we're not elevating our instruction or the text that we select to root out that darkness, that's problematic. But from a biblical perspective, darkness comes before light. And so darkness is not something that we should be paralyzed by, but we should know if we want to shape a different trajectory, we have to think about ways that, one, we support boys to move toward that light, but also we make sure that they do not engage in self-annihilation behaviors in literacy classrooms. And we have a responsibility to show up in a way that says, I am a child of the light, and I can think about multiple texts, multiple disciplines, because that's how I'm going to protect myself and those who come after me, thus securing their futures.
So if you are listening, I have to tell you, chapters 1 and 2 really do make you understand darkness, but then chapters 3 and beyond, instead of paralyzing you or making you dwell in guilt, chapters 3 and beyond really show you how you can go towards the light. And one of the things that I loved towards the end of chapter 2 is that you talked about that Black boys need teachers and parents who adopt a threefold embrace, ensuring they have excellent academic preparation, nurturing a strong identity, academic confidence, and ethic of self-discipline, and then preparing these boys to play prominent roles in their communities and the world. Mm-hmm. So that's the way towards the light. Now, when we get to chapter 3, you really do start talking about your model. And I want you to explain a little bit about how you got to your MDRM. And I'm going to ask you to tell them what it is, as a way to move students towards advanced levels of literacy development. And when you talk about that, it would be great for you to mention on like the selection of texts, because that's something that it's clearly a big deal. And Dr. Tatum, I am going to share the graphic if you want to talk around that.
I'll put this in very quickly, I'll put this in a broader context. When I developed this model, my own son, who was in elementary school at the time, 8 years old, was reading at the 96th percentile. But I was still disappointed with his reading and writing instruction. At that same time, I was directing a reading clinic where I had boys who were really struggling with reading. And I said, is there a model out there to ensure that none of our children are underserved in literacy classrooms? I also wanted to break apart the argument that we should focus on skills and strategies, or we should focus on high quality text. So this multidimensional reading model, this was the best name I could come up with. It's ensuring that you have a strong concept of reading, fluency, and decoding. I call that the Zoom zone. Usually when you have struggling readers, and you can see it broken apart of this line, usually when you have struggling readers, some of their instruction finds residence below that line. But also, because writing is so critical, I said, how do we begin to assess the reading and writing in one lesson while focus on personal and academic growth? But the key to all of this was, how do you do this in every single hour of instruction? And so when I look at the young boys' lives, I approach literacy with the same level of urgency that is required moving forward. Now, this was really designed to do a couple of things. and this is the head behind it. I said, I want to avoid cultural erasure while also giving them an intellectual pathway that nurtures more of a humanitarian pathway moving forward. But I also wanted to nurture social and scientific consciousness. And so this means I had to expand the types of text that I placed in front of students. So I wanted them to read engineering, physics, chemistry, mathematics, biology, literature, etc. This was a model that gave me affordances to make sure that each of these boys became better readers, became smarter about the text, while nurturing their social and scientific consciousness as they began to build an agenda, a long-term agenda for their lives and for those they may be responsible for.
And you mentioned in your book that research that identifies ways to quickly accelerate the reading and writing achievement of Black boys in the elementary grades does not exist. And there is no Black male literacy equation for advanced reading, writing, and intellectual development. And so calling attention to how you bring multiple things together. One of the things, Dr. Tatum, that concerns me these days is that people are tending to go back to separating everything. And even like subskills, instead of engaging in high leverage activities where subskills are working together, the decoding and encoding, and now everything is separated. And what happens there is that you never get to the writing, you never get to content knowledge, right? Because all of your time is spent just on the Zoom zone. And it's almost like, it reminds me of the pyramid, Maslow's hierarchy, right? Because if you only stay at the bottom, you never achieve the top. And that's what it reminds me of. Can you give an example, like in the book, you give several examples of how you envisioned the units and how the choice of units and texts really is what allows you to bring all of this together. And if you don't mind, like we have noticed this too, and starting in kindergarten, our units are science units and kids learn to read through science. So you have zoology, ecology, entomology, and it's such fun topics and interesting topics, and kids learn all those words that they wouldn't necessarily come across in kindergarten anywhere else. And it made me think about the type of thinking that we do in putting units together. But if you could give us an example, I was so impressed by your choices.
So I'm a reading pragmatist. And so I have to take conceptualizations and actually work with young boys. And so what you're going to see throughout the text are sample lessons, multiple lessons across a wide range of discipline. I'll give one example, but I want to just read one quick quote from the book before I give an example.
Sure.
Because it's advanced reading that's important. And I said, while focusing on advanced reading, writing, and intellectual development, for elementary age Black boys may create a cognitive disconnect or rupturing of professional or pedagogical underpinnings. And so it's important for others to see how Black boys, one thing I missed, this model had third graders reading and writing across a minimum of 2 texts during every hour. For some, that is a cognitive disconnect. And I want to give you an example of the types of 2 texts that I put in front of you. In the African-American community, you hear a lot about diabetes or some health-related matters. So taking that from a biological perspective, I said, what if I put a text in front of Black boys that deals with green tea, which is not a sugary drink, and then teach them about antioxidants. Well, green tea has the antioxidants, but a conversation about antioxidants is not something you usually have in third grade. And so bringing something that's very practical, the agenda here was, can we change our drinking habits while also becoming smart about science and letting others know that antioxidants are critical for fighting cancer? So I had to couple two texts, and then I had boys write about antioxidants. But the focus from a developmental perspective, and you're going to see these examples about consciousness, the brain, poop, all of these topics.
Poop.
I mean,
Yeah.
engineering.
So
yeah,
kids will like poop.
right. Engineering. So you'll see all of this, and you'll see the boys writing. But at the end of this lesson, while we focus on that diagram that you showed, I was developing the concept of reading, nurturing fluency, decoding, and then they had the read and write across green tea and antioxidants. This is not a word or concept that I was reluctant to put in front of these boys because they deserve this information. But when I say personal development, along with intellectual development, there was one a third grader who said, I think I'm going to drink more green tea instead of sugary drinks. Now, that was an outgrowth of the knowledge development that exists. Now, I don't know what the formula is or which Black boys are more likely to become intellectuals, but I know moving all of the students toward advanced level does not create harm for anyone.
Yeah.
And so there is no harm when we connect young elementary students to topics that are being discussed across the entire world. And now you take it from your humanitarian perspective or cultural perspective. And so you too are now well-deserved by text. You could be characterized as a struggling reader or an advanced reader. I'm just trying to make sure that no student is underserved when it comes to reading skills and strategies, when it comes to knowledge development, and when it comes to humanitarian development. And I tell you, I was so fortunate to witness this happen. But this is why I started with the quote. For some to imagine that it's a cognitive disconnect. And we have to sort of move beyond that particular focus and not be reluctant to give them the best text among us.
I think that's what you're saying reminds me of, and Wendy's here can also speak to that, how often we hear at the end of a year of ARC Core, I never believed my kids would be able to do this. I would never believe that a kindergartner would be able to publish a book on zoology or ecology, or we hear this over and over again. And I also think it's important, you mentioned in the book that sometimes the kids at first don't have they are complaining about, oh, there's so much reading and writing. And you're like, that's a good complaint. That's a good problem to have, but you don't back away. They might take a break, but they come right back because the topic is also compelling. You talk about a concept that I never heard before, but it really spoke to me. You talk about social and scientific literacy authorizations. Can you expand on that? And again, what is at stake?
So I saw so many professionals here, and whether they're literacy specialists or administrators, anytime we choose to teach a lesson in a particular way or put certain text in front of students, we are authorizing something. We're either authorizing advanced reading, we're authorizing slow growth, or we can be authorizing erasure, as I talked about. So my own experience from middle school, elementary, middle, and high school, when I look at my readings that impacted me, most of them were sociological in nature. Someone authorized low volume of scientific text. Now, that didn't do any harm for me, but my trajectories could have been shaped very differently. Anytime we select text or we're planning for students, it is governed by what we envision moving forward. So I'll give you an example of a question that I use to shape my authorization. I think that may help. And this is focusing on writing. So I asked the question, what leads a Black boy to write? So I can authorize writing skills and strategies. But then I said, what leads an elementary age Black boy to write about statistics, economics, sociology, neuroscience, history, and culture? If I ask that second question, I have to authorize text differently because you can't write about those things unless I put those in front of you. But then here's the third question. What leads him to write about these topics at the same time? That goes back to the Black intellectual tradition, green tea, antioxidants, writing about both at the same time. And then here's the last question. What leads Black boys to ask questions or insert themselves into the social and scientific phenomena or controversy shaping human history? I'm talking about 8-year-olds now.
Yeah.
That last question is very different from what leads a Black boy to write. I can say, well, let me teach him the 6 traits of writing, but he's never writing about statistics, sociology, economics, culture, and he's not writing about these things at the same time. And so what you'll see in the book are instructional practices that led boys to write about these topics at the same time. I want to give a quick personal example, and please control the time here.
No. Go ahead.
When I was in elementary school, I clearly remember learning about the brain. And I had to label parts of the brain: cerebrum, cerebellum, and medulla oblongata, a word I just love. I said medulla oblongata, medulla oblongata. So that lesson could have been sufficient in and of itself. But outside of that elementary classroom, they were talking about the brain. The experts were talking about consciousness, which is what we're still talking about today. So while someone had me labeling parts of the brain, which I could do with ease, I was never part of the grander conversation about the brain and consciousness. Someone authorized those differences. It could have been curricular or something else. I could have been the #1 leader on consciousness in society, as opposed to a grand labeler of cerebrum, cerebellum, and medulla oblongata. So that's an example of authorizations and how they could shape different trajectories.
And I want to call attention, like if you are a NARC user, I hope you're making connection to the research questions and how even the research questions are ordered, because it always ends, the last couple of questions are always about bringing different disciplines together and applying to the world, to the community. So it's really important that we make these connections. And again, we often hear in the first year, they can't do this, they can't do this. And the way you organize the instruction, the way you organize the texts, it's really important that we provide this pathway to light. You talk, something that really stood out to me is like talking about what we authorize, what texts, and you talk a lot about, it seems to be more kosher to think about and authorize the texts that touch on sociology. Can you push us a little bit beyond, like push us, Dr. Tatum? I want you to.
Let me give you a quick quote and then I'll follow with an example.
Okay.
I wrote in the book, Blackness, systemic racism, and bifurcated educational practices are drowning out the focus on reading for young Black boys who move beyond the early years of schooling. For example, the Black Lives Matter chorus in the United States is louder than the call for advanced literacy and knowledge development for Black boys. So it makes sense when you think about Blackness, systemic racism, and bifurcated education experiences to focus on text from a sociological aim that deals with identity. So that makes a lot of sense. There's nothing wrong with that, but I argue that it is limited because we're talking about social and scientific consciousness as a tool of protection. Let me put this in a broader context. So I can take Blackness, systemic racism, bifurcated educational practices, and talk about policing and Black men in society. Makes sense. In the New York Times, for example, Black and Latino males were being strangled, chokeholds from the police officers. The autopsy report said they were dying from sickle cell anemia. Chokeholds, police brutality, sociological. Sickle cell anemia, scientific. Are you with me?
Yeah.
So if I'm not threading social and scientific consciousness, I can argue or beat the streets about police brutality, absolutely necessary, but I'm still not nurturing the next generation of Black males who address the issues of sickle cell anemia. And so if this is something that is adversely impacting Black men and Black women, how are we nurturing that next generation from a social consciousness perspective to move forward? And oftentimes I make the distinction, not I don't make the distinction, I argue for a complement. We often talk about social justice, but how do we talk about scientific justice? If you have both of those combined, it's going to dictate or suggest that we must authorize text very differently. I'll give another example that you'll find in the text is oftentimes you have statistics that Black boys are more likely to, whether it's suspended or X or Y. But those statistics are based on regression analysis. And so should young Black boys grow up interpreting or subscribing to those statistics, or should they be generating those statistics? So now I have to read an article on regression analysis as early as the elementary grades and plug it into an Excel file. You're getting to the same thing. So stats are used to dehumanize someone. I can talk about dehumanization, sociological, or I can talk about regression and analysis, scientific. Our boys must have all of those. And that's how I take that model and say, how do I couple the social and the scientific in a developmentally appropriate way in third grade as I'm thinking about nurturing the life of the mind. This is not a conversation we generally have with elementary age students. And so while I'm explaining this, I concretize this in the book with clear examples and the writing outputs or writing artifacts from elementary age boys. I really appreciate that question.
And for those of you thinking, what if they can't access the text? Believe me, how to read multi-syllable words, how to identify syllables, how to have, how to engage in flexible decoding. All of those are also in there in the book, but integrated. Like think about the triangle, it's integrated. In the questions that you are posing, how do we currently ask questions and what questions should we be asking are also in the text. I'm a big fan, Dr. Tatum. I think I'm going to become your agent, I think.
I love it.
Wendy, do we have any questions before I go on?
You are good to go, but this is a reminder to people that if they do have any burning questions, please feel free to add them to the chat, and I'll be paying attention to see what comes next.
And people are asking when your book is coming out, and I was very lucky to read it ahead of time because of this this interview that we are having. But It's coming out in December, right, Dr. Tatum?
December 3rd.
December 3rd. You can pre-order, so just do it.
Amazon.com and Teachers College Press.
Go ahead. What?
I said Amazon.com or Teachers College Press.
Okay. Wendy, do you have any questions, or otherwise I'm going to keep going?
So I know what questions are coming next, so I'm very excited for them, and I will let you keep going.
Okay.
But I'm just taking it all in.
When it gets to writing, again, your examples are so incredible and real. You call writing the true intellectual exercise, and you say that it is not enough to have Black boys write. It is important that excellent writing become part of their academic and intellectual signatures. Can you talk about writing and the role of texts and explicit instruction to make that happen?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And so one of the points that I was making is that Black boys should never feel like intellectual trespassers for any topic. And so there is a tendency to embrace Black male expertise in some areas while excluding it from others. So if we're going to ensure that our young children rightfully own all disciplines and display that through their own writing, for whatever reason, to remember, Black intellectual tradition is about shaping the thinking of others. And so going back to the example earlier, you could write about antioxidants, you could write about sickle cell anemia, you can write about the amygdala in the brain, because those topics belong to you. And so giving them these experiences early on, and now throughout the book, I looked at the Black intellectual tradition and say, how do they write interdisciplinarily? And so what you see throughout the text is these interdisciplinary starters that shows Black boys how to read across multiple texts. And so you're going to see third and fourth grade boys within one paragraph reading across two texts, citing multiple authors, and demonstrating the value of that particular knowledge. That's how James Baldwin wrote. That's how Dr. King wrote. That's how Elaine Locke wrote. That's how Black intellectual women wrote. That's how intellectuals across all disciplines wrote. And so I give you this writing frame, interdisciplinary starters, and a litmus test to have these boys cite multiple texts in one paragraph. And it was just, it just blows your mind. So, they're citing Maya Angelou and Elie Wiesel. These are 8 and 9-year-olds. They're citing philosophers as they write about child labor and as they write about genetic engineering. But you can't do that if you're not reading those types of text. So it's communicated through writing is, yes, you can read these texts, but you are never an intellectual trespasser as you write these texts. And it is your responsibility to take your cultural identities, your community identities, your social consciousness and scientific consciousness, and let your writing be imbued with that. Because at the end of the writing, you too become smarter, because writing is the intellectual exercise. And I often say you can fake reading, but you can't fake writing. And when you have young boys in an environment writing that way, it is such a glorious thing to witness.
You can fake reading, but you can't fake writing. I hope somebody's tweeting this right now. One of the things that really stood out to me is the process of writing and rewriting across days, right? So I think the idea, I always tell my kids, the first pancake is never right. You gotta keep going, and you show how, like, the first time, and then how it grew across time. But also, you provide examples about the importance of having exemplars that they can relate to, that it shows that it's possible. But you also allow kids to talk and really, really exchange ideas and thoughts prior to writing. And they might write together or separately, but you allow for that to happen. I just think that's incredible. And again, it's very aligned with our philosophy of what a classroom should look like, sound like, feel like. It's not the teacher in front of the room. It's a noisy classroom.
Yeah. I'm going to reframe. This is the same thing, Amelia, but I'm going to reframe it differently.
Okay.
We're allowed to have this conversation because we are impregnated with thought. So it's not me as the instructor that allows them to have conversation. It's the impregnation of thought that really is allowing them to have these conversations. And so the smarter you become and the more analytical tools you're using, it engenders this type of dialogue. And so you cannot suppress when you are excited about knowledge or information. And I say that because it's not about an environmental context. The talk was really authorized by the texts that were placed in front of students.
Yes.
And now I'm giddy. I want to talk about, germs or boogers, or the brain being the seat of fear, or the brain and dancing. We're reading a lesson on the brain and exercise. Not only talk, act out. So this one boy found out that, exercise improves your intelligence. So he gets on the floor and he starts doing push-ups. I said, man, what are you doing? He says, I'm improving my intelligence, Dr. Tatum. So you still have this, they're still young kids. He would not have otherwise started push-ups moving forward. But I also want to say something about the writing as well, because I don't want to miss the instructional aims of this. I cannot provide robust feedback unless I actually see something in writing. And so when a kid writes child labor and spells labor L-A-B-E-R, based on O-R or E-R or A-R, you still see these things occurring. But they're so enthralled in this, and now I could say, hey man, or give an explicit writing lesson on spelling. I can do it with punctuation as well too. And so I said these boys are writing across multiple text. So there are times when I just said, put, for example, comma. This is how you use a comma when you're writing across multiple text. Now you get all of that. And so it wasn't just the rich writing, it was the high quality writing that will serve them well and allow them to take themselves serious as an intellectual. Or as a writer. I'll take intellectual away from this. Take themselves seriously as a writer because they know those particular moves. You notice I didn't say have others take them serious as a writer. I want them to take themselves seriously as a writer first, and then embrace the broader responsibility. So here I am writing a text that I hope benefits others. I first had to learn to take myself seriously as a writer. And if I know that's part of the overall tradition, that is something that needs to be captured each hour of instruction. Teaching reading and writing is a beautiful thing if we authorize it in powerful ways. And I
don't think we outgrow this, because everything that you're describing, I felt reading the book. I felt giddy. I felt richness of thought. And I started connecting. I had just read Think Again by Adam Grant. I went back to Zaretta Hammond's book. There were so many things that you made me think of. So you are not young enough or old enough for this to happen. Just saying. I just turned 58, so I'm just saying. It happened to me too.
We do have a question in the chat that might relate to that.
Okay, go ahead.
So the question is, because I think you've mentioned many ways in which we can empower students to make these moves. But one question was, how do you help them to be willing to take academic risks and read challenging material?
That's the only thing I put in front of them. It just becomes part of the culture. And so what begins to happen? And this really goes with the model. I want to take this question seriously because that's a very important question. If you saw the 7 parts of the multidimensional reading model, sometimes you give them access at the conceptual level. Other times you break down the decoding and fluency barrier. It's not inconsequential that all of these things are there at the same time. Other times you focus on rigor by placing a gorgeous word in front of them. So one of the first words I put in front of a group of 3rd graders was the word diverticulitis. Very challenging. And you can be thrown off right away if you're a struggling reader. But if I show you how to break that down in a simple way, diverticulitis, when we were talking about the gut, belongs to you. And then having a chance to read about this text, do you sit or do you squat when you poop? So remember, I'm teaching the kids about diverticulitis in a rigorous way and how to decode, but they're also analyzing, is it better to sit or squat when you poop? And so if I take that question, that is part of the planning process. Rigorous text may suggest that you break down the barrier at the conceptual level, at the word level, at the fluency level, at the paragraph level, or the writing level. It is incumbent upon us, if we're going to make sure that students are well served, rigorous, not rigorous text, break down those barriers and give them experiences that opens up the vista for them to read powerful, engaging, silly, sad, funny, extraordinary, dull text. Because all of us won't have exciting text every time we teach.
Correct.
But for the most part, if we're conceptualizing literacy as a tool of protection across all of the disciplines, we'll find the appropriate balance to shape those life outcome trajectories. And I really like that question because in some classrooms, the literacy development of Black boys is mortgaged. Mortgaged is a term used in political and economic surfaces that says their reading and writing lives are placed at risk. So anytime you hear that term, mortgaging. We never want to do anything that mortgages the literacy development and the lives of our students. And there are 7 points in that model that strikes against that mortgaging while I'm selecting those texts based on those authorizations that we described earlier. I really appreciate that question. I hope I answered it fully.
It's a wonderful question. Thank you. And I do want to talk about this because the science of reading these days is getting a lot of attention. And the immediate, my first thought was, boy, this book can add so much to this conversation. Talk about my reaction and what do you think about ways to elevate the current conversation that is an important conversation, but should be elevated?
When we're thinking about the mosaic of the young people in our nation, for any approach, we have to ask the question, is it wide enough and broad enough to nurture the next generation of readers, writers, thinkers, etc.? So if we take the science of reading, for example, and we ask the question, is it wide enough and broad enough to fully nurture the next generation of reader, writers, and thinkers, then it's the pathway forward. But we have so many students who are already reading well. This is why I gave the example of my son reading at the 96th percentile. Other kids are struggling. Those kids are in the same environment. So if I go in a classroom with the science of reading whole group, then my son or others who are similarly situated will be underserved. If I go in with the science of reading and I begin to provide kids with the requisite skills and knowledges, they're going to benefit from that. But the question is, are we slow walking them through schools, which is another potential dilemma. Now, in similar ways that I have a litmus test of where reading and writing instruction can lead us, and I give these multiple examples, it is not always clear what that trajectory looks like for the science of reading. Anybody who teaches reading must know how to teach reading. So you must be familiar with the research. I had to become familiar with the research as I think about concept of reading, as I think about phonemic awareness, as I think about decoding. That's the Zoom zone that I share with you. And I said how others can be locked in that Zoom zone for a long time. And so there are models where you say, I'm going to use the science of reading. And then you say, by the end of 2023, which is 2 years from now, I don't know when, what is this, 2023, that's 2 years from now. And you say, we're going to get 85% of our kids reading at a proficient level. It's already forecasting it's going to take me 2 years to get 8 out of 10 students reading at a proficient level. Is that something we want as a nation? And the argument that I'm making in this book is it's taboo to talk about advanced levels of reading and writing. So how do we take the knowledge from the science of reading, accelerate it in a way that nurtures social and scientific consciousness? That becomes the question. Now, if I'm working with a dyslexic student, or if I'm working with a student who has severe decoding issues, that's a one-on-one something. Yeah. That's not something you should legislate school-wide, classroom-wide, district-wide, because you're building in a system that will leave a large percentage of the students underserved who have already moved beyond the need of the science of reading.
So and let's not lower the bar, right? No slow walking kids through school.
Well, I pull from Ellis Coles. He said, if you slow walk kids through school, you start slow walking them through life. And that's when young people start surrendering their life chances before they get to know their life choices, and they begin to say, to hell with schooling. This is about restoration of literacy in this nation, that at the end of the day, we could say we were not part of that long-term mortgaging. Let's do it in a way that honors not just their reading needs, which is absolutely important. And by the way, the science of reading does not give a lot of attention to writing. There's a growing body of research, but it's less than on the reading side of that. And so how do we think about this from a more comprehensive lens without ever leaving the reader behind? So for example, I would find it distasteful if all of my students were having grand conversations and beautiful ideas and all this consciousness, but if they can't decode, they can't read, or they can't write, I have become an inadvertent accomplice to their failure, and I have positioned them to be dependents as opposed to self-dependent, as opposed to being independent, self-reliant, and self-empowered.
I hope you guys are just dying to get this book. Just listening to him, right? I want to go back and read it again. Our time is almost gone, but there's a chapter towards the end of the book that you talk about big data. and the current research and the types of questions and studies that are funded,
Yeah.
conducted. What is the one thing you want literacy researchers to keep in mind moving forward?
It is important. I'll tell you what I did. I don't know what to tell all literacy researchers. It is important that we move beyond narrow frames of scholarship. So you can get trapped behind a particular research model, research article, research study. But when I look at Black boys, for example, the research base is really thin. Over the last 20 years, 2.2 articles per year have been published on the literature development of Black boys across pre-K through 12. Most of these studies have less than 30 participants. Now we're talking about 4 million Black boys across the US, very few research studies. And so it is incumbent upon all of us to, and I make this point in the last chapter, there are questions that have landed me where I am today, but you have to ask those questions, interrogate the research, interrogate your practices, and then you contribute to this overall research architecture. But as you do that, I recommend that you don't start at, can I teach them how to read? Can I make them basic or proficient? How do you think larger, wider, broader, and deeper for that? And that's how we build a national research architecture. Everyone here has a potential to become part of the science of reading. That is not settled. There is no study in the United States of America involving Black boys that says, I went in this classroom or school district and moved a large percent of these boys to an advanced level. Interrogate the research, conduct the research, ask your questions, and allow us to become the beneficiary of your knowledge.
I feel so privileged to have spent this time with you. We are thrilled that you are a closer part of our family. We have been fans of yours for a very long time. But boy, you're going to make us better and better every day. I want to thank you for your time, for your kindness, for your intellect. You make us better. You make us better. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. He will be back. I promise you, he will be back. Thank you. And what is next month? What do we have next month? All right, so join us next month. Dr. Irvin Scott is going to be hosting some educational leaders across the country that are actually implementing a solution that is attempting to move more elementary students towards advanced levels of literacy. So I can't wait.